Well, this is it. This is Tim at 12, and this is the brand new thing that we're starting here at City Life. I just got to tell you for a second, this has been like a dream of mine. I've thought about this for quite some time of being able to bring some kind of a noon broadcast word of encouragement. And it really started out a long time ago, back when I used to do Marketplace Church at City Life on Fridays, and I really enjoyed that noon hour, being able to connect with people. And that's several years in the past, and I've just had this idea of I'd love to do this sometime. And with this current situation and everything that's changing around us with the COVID-19, I thought, well, it's a perfect opportunity just to interact, because I don't get to see and touch you guys face to face, and this is an opportunity to do that. So we decided to call it Tim at 12 because it's just me. It's just me, and we're doing it at noon. So that's pretty simple. But part of the reason that it's just me is that in the event that I'm going to be away from the office or alone at home, I don't need any production team. In fact, I have no production team for this. There's no one who's working alongside of me, no one who's running the audio or the lighting or anything. So if something messes up, well, it's my fault. So here's the deal. Just laugh at me, make fun of me, because trust me, I'll be making fun of myself, and I'll be, it's like, oh, why did you do that? But there are going to be errors in here and mistakes and little things that are not going to look perfect. So please know that my goal with this has never been for it to be a highly produced podcast show for YouTube. I just want to chat with you. And my purpose also in this is Bible study. We're going to study the Bible together. This is not like preaching. This is different than preaching. This is Bible study, and we're going to be starting with a brand new topic as I'm getting this going. And I have a series that I'm going to be starting now, and I'm calling it Understanding the End. Understanding the End, and that's going to help us just to know what is happening. I know there are a lot of questions about this. Is COVID-19 one of those things that's mentioned in the Bible? And we'll talk about that. What are some other things we see worldwide that are happening? Is it mentioned in the Bible? Where is it? And let's talk about it. So I think the best place to go to start off with this, with understanding the end, is to go to the book of Matthew, and that would be Matthew chapter number 18, Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 8. And Matthew 24, 1 through 8 is a good place to get started, because this is what's called the Olivet Discourse. Now, if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to open up, because I'm going to be pointing out words and phrases. I'm going to use the New International Version most of the time, and if I go to something else, I'll tell you what I'm changing to. But I think it's important that we jump into this. And so this first part of understanding the end, this week, today and tomorrow and the next day, I'm going to be doing a teaching called Signs. So today is part one of Signs. Now, many years ago, when I first started doing full-time ministry, I would have people saying, hey, we want you to teach on prophecy. And I, after listening to some people who had been around for a while, I'm talking seasoned ministers, I adopted a philosophy. And it was this: I will start teaching prophecy when I get gray hair. Not that I was afraid to teach it before, but I really believe that you need to have a few miles behind you. You need to have a little bit of wisdom. We see that the prophets typically in the Bible were people who were a little bit older. And so I also want to be able to take what's here in the scriptures, and this is just my philosophy. So if your hair isn't gray and you like to teach prophecy, good for you. But yeah, that was my philosophy. I want to have some gray hair. And it wasn't long after I said that, and my hair started changing. Someone in my church came up to me and said, Pastor Tim, your hair's turning gray. You going to do a series on prophecy? And I said, actually, yeah, I am. And so I really started teaching and preaching on this, and I've done extensive Bible study on prophecy. I love prophecy, so we're going to talk about it. Now, one of the things about prophecy, I'm going to give you a kind of a little primer on that before we dive into Matthew 24. One of the things about prophecy is discursive. Now, the way to understand this is to think of cursive handwriting. See, all of the letters are connected in cursive handwriting. It all flows together. But prophecy is not like that. It doesn't flow all together. Prophecy is discursive, meaning that the speaker or the writer often jumps from one subject to another. They do not give any reference to time or timing, and it's also not in any particular order. Therefore, it is discursive. If you were to take all of the letters of the alphabet and to throw them onto, have little alphabet letters, like you had when you were a kid, and throw them all onto a table and mix them up, that's how prophecy really often looks like. It's not all connected, but all the pieces are there. So another thing to understand about prophecy is a prophet, and we see this through the Bible, a prophet is not really aware of huge gaps of time within his own prophecy. Now, if you've ever been to the Rocky Mountains, I've driven through there so many times, and one of the things that you see is you see the mountains off in the distance. But what you see from a distance is not what you see when you're actually right up against the mountains, and it certainly isn't what you see when you're in the mountains, and you don't even really understand what you saw or what you went through until you get to the other side of the mountains. And so distance makes a difference. There's perspective and the arrangement, and really prophecy, I'll tell you, it is not as it appears. Just like the Rocky Mountains, it's not as it appears. See, because a larger mountain can appear to be closer than it really is. Then there can be smaller mountains, and you may not even see them. They're not even visible. You can't see the valleys that are in the mountain range. You can't predict the distance between the mountains because they're shadows. And typically, it often takes longer for you to get to the mountain than you originally think. And another thing about it is really it all depends on perspective. Now, prophets often saw the same events, but they saw them from a different perspective. And so it's like looking at a mountain. You can look at a mountain from a different perspective, and that mountain is going to look different. If you're looking from the north, it's going to look different than the same mountain does if you're looking from the east. And other mountains may not be in view of that from your particular angle that you're taking on it. So understand this is that we might say, well, this person didn't say that, that person didn't say this, and this person says this, and this person says this. What does it all mean? It's all the difference of perspective. So that's a normal thing, because sometimes like a prophet is standing right on the mountain, and that gives a very different perspective than if you're looking at it from a distance. So I really do not take what I call a timeline approach or a timeline interpretation of prophecy. Now, I know there are lots of prophetic timelines that are out there, and I think that's great to study. I've done a lot of that, and timelines help us to kind of comprehend everything. And we tend to do timelines because timelines is the easiest way to remember things. But here's the deal. We can't get too confident of this impeccable interpretation of prophecies that are yet to be fulfilled. And there's a good reason for that. Think about this. The prophets themselves, they didn't fully understand their own prophecies. Also, think about this. The disciples of Jesus Christ and even the teachers of the scriptures, they didn't even see Jesus as the Messiah when he walked on the earth, with the exception of Peter, because prophecy is not easy to interpret, even when the prophecy is being fulfilled right in front of your eyes. And that's really important for us to understand. Right now, a lot of people saying this is happening and this is happening, it's in the Bible. I do struggle with that. They may be right, but I have some gray hair here, and I'll just tell you the truth. I've seen this said all the time, and almost every time it's been wrong. Not to say they're wrong right now, but it is really tough to see prophecy being fulfilled right in front of your eyes. But it is rather simple to interpret it in retrospect. So when I teach prophecy, I don't teach it from the perspective of a dogmatic intellectual who has it all figured out, because I don't. And in fact, no one other than God the Father has it all figured out. And I also want you to remember this. Jesus Christ himself doesn't even know when he will return. The prophets have spoken. Jesus doesn't know when he's going to return. So when someone says Jesus is coming back on a certain date, like, wow, then you know something Jesus himself doesn't know. That's really, really interesting. So I want you to understand this. The timeline shouldn't bother us. There's some other things about prophecy that are important to us, and another one is that God does not give us prophecy to fulfill our sense of curiosity about the future. It's not about what this is all going to look like so we can understand it. And And God also, doesn't give it to us for that reason. Actually, God gives us prophecy so that we can have this understanding or this knowledge that God had foreknowledge of world events. And this really shows us that God is in control of world events, and it gives us peace, especially when you look back at prophecies that are already fulfilled, and it's very, very clear that they've been fulfilled. And another thing about prophecy is prophecy, and you'll see this in my teaching as well, prophecy gives believers very specific instructions on what to do when you see certain things happening. And you're going to hear, I'm going to draw your attention to that because there's always application to the prophecy. It's not just there to tantalize you with some cool little details. And finally, the big truth is prophecy brings comfort. That's really what it does. Okay, well, let's dive into our teaching today. That's just a little bit of a framework of what I believe about prophecy and my approach to it. And I want to get us to get right into Matthew chapter 24. We're going to look at verse number 1, and let's take a look at it here. It says, Jesus left the temple in Jerusalem and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its building. So this is a few days right before the crucifixion of Jesus, and some of the disciples at this point were thinking, hey, this probably is the Messiah. They're thinking this might be. And they were thinking, of course, because they didn't understand prophecy, they're thinking, well, it's been prophesied, the Messiah is going to come and sit in the temple. So they were actually kind of sizing up their new headquarters. That's really what they were doing. And then Jesus jolted them. And in verse 2, he says, do you see these things? He's pointing at the building. He's pointing at this huge, massive structure. I mean, it was about, the highest point of the temple was about 20 stories high. And I'm telling you guys, that was huge in those days. That's half the size of one of the highest towers here in downtown Fort Worth. But Jesus said, do you see all these things? I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another, and everyone will be thrown down. The temple is going to be destroyed. Kind of freaked them out. This was already taken care of. So Jesus was prophesying. We know that in 70 AD, Emperor Titus of Rome came into Jerusalem because of the uprising and literally destroyed the temple, tearing apart every single block, every brick. So, and another problem with this is the disciples, they're thinking this because they also understand prophecy, or they know some of the prophecies. And if there's no temple, then there's no Messiah. So I want you to see the setting. As Jesus moves into this teaching on prophecy, you got to understand the setting. Jesus is talking to the disciples. In their mind, they're thinking they're about ready to go into this temple, and they're going to set up their headquarters in there. And Jesus just said it's going to be torn down. Now, again, this is not a public teaching of Jesus, but it's a teaching to his disciples who are just riveted because they're just thinking, okay, maybe our dreams of what we thought was about to happen isn't going to turn out as we suppose. So the disciples, they asked Jesus. And so really the rest of the teaching that we see here in 24 and 25 of Matthew, it's at the request of the disciples. This teaching was not initiated by Jesus. So take a look at verse 3. It says, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. They said, tell us, keep in mind their frame of mind, why did Jesus just say the whole building is going to be turned down? That's supposed to be our headquarters, okay? Tell us, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of the coming and of the end of the age? So Jesus was really posed two different questions here. Now that's important to understand because he's going to talk for 2 whole chapters and tell several stories. In Matthew 24 and 25, he answers these questions, but he doesn't give quick little answers. It's a lengthy discourse. So really what we see here was Jesus was coming to him and he was really answering this question: what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So what is a sign? Well, a sign, and I've done my word studies on this, the word sign simply means a mark or an indicator. So the disciples were looking for what the marks were, what the indicators were, and actually they were asking for one sign. Well, Jesus doesn't give them one sign. Jesus gives them several signs. And so they were thinking of 2 different events: his coming, the coming of the Messiah, and the end of, the coming of all of these events and the end of the age. And the truth is, really, all of this happens in one event. So they asked for the sign of his coming, which is the establishment of God's kingdom on this earth. And they also asked about the sign of the end of the age, which is the end of the church age, which is the time that we're in right now. So Jesus answered then with this dramatic monologue, and he goes into these stories for 2 chapters. So what we're going to do is we're going to break it down, and in some cases, word for word over the next few weeks. Read through Matthew 24 and 25 because it'll give you a taste of what's ahead. And I don't want you to miss any of it because this is all heavy prophetic teaching of Jesus. So now look in verse number 4 as Jesus continues. All right, so Jesus said, watch out that no one deceives you. Then he said, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many. And he says, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Then he says in verse 7, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. And then he says, all of this is the beginning of birth pains. So he starts off with this by saying, don't be deceived. That's what he's calling us to do. So that's the action item he's saying right here. He gives the teaching, but at the beginning he says, in other words, don't let anyone deceive you. Don't let your mind deceive you. I'm going to explain to you clearly what's happening. And so what Jesus then does is he goes in and he begins to explain some of the signs that are happening. There's these first waves of signs. The very first wave of signs that he talks about, I would say these are the works of hell to destroy creation. Now, Satan, keep in mind, he hates all of God's creation. You are God's creation. He hates this earth. He hates everything in it. So Satan, he's in this goal to destroy creation. And we see several things that are spoken of in here that I just want to draw your attention to. He said, at this time, there are going to be false messiahs. What the word Messiah means anointed. So there will be people. And now, please understand, we think of the Messiah as the Messiah. We think of it as Jesus. But really, that means anointed people. So there are, and Jesus says there will be, and there currently are, people who appear to be anointed by God. But it's a false anointing. These people aren't from God, and they're saying a lot of people are going to follow them. Now, we have to understand, if you're teaching the gospel of Jesus, well, that's different. But there will be others that will teach modifications of it, or even things that are different than the gospel, and people will follow them, but they're not giving the gospel. All right? Another one that he says is wars and what I call chatter about wars. That's where he says rumors about war. It means discussions about war. People are constantly talking about war. We've seen already those first 2 signs happen in our culture. We're all very well aware of it. Take a look at the third one that he brings up here. Jesus then says that nations will rise against nations, but the nations word, we think of that as like the United States against Canada, which, that's not real. But really what this is, and this is good, these are actually people groups. Then that word nations there means ethnos. So these are people groups that rise up against other people groups. Now, let me tell you, anything in culture that pits one group of people against another group of people and causes those people to fight and engage in warring against one another, whether it's in the United States, our own city, or whether it's worldwide, when people groups rise up against each other, then that is another one of those signs of the end time. We see it. We see it in the culture. It's all around us. He also then says that kingdoms will rise against kingdoms. Now that actually, when he's saying kingdoms there, he's literally speaking of nations such as like Russia or Afghanistan. That's literal. Again, we see that happening as well. And then he goes on to talk about famines. So what that word famine means, it actually has a dual meaning there in the New International Version. It speaks of scarcity of food, and it also speaks of plague and disease. Now, this is where people say, well, then does this speaking about COVID-19? I believe this is one of those things. I know that grocery stores are low on food right now, but we really don't have a scarcity of food. There's food around to be eaten, but when it comes to the place where there is scarcity of food, that's the case. But here, we may not be seeing it right here in the United States of America, but that is happening all over the globe. Starvation is happening everywhere. Scarcity of food. And then the second component of that is, in that term famines, is plague or disease. So whenever there are these huge outbreaks of disease, these are signs of the end. They're signs of the end. Another one that Jesus brings up is earthquakes. And so we all know what that is. Earthquakes means earthquakes. There was just one this past week in the Salt Lake City area. But then what Jesus says is that this is all the beginning of birth pangs. And really keep in mind, it's the work of hell to destroy creation. But what are birth pangs? Well, if any of you have had a baby, ladies, you would know what this is. Any of you men who have been around a lady who's having a baby, you understand as well a little bit from a different perspective, but they are the birth pangs are mild at first, and then there's this large space between them, and just very mild, this large space, and then another mild one. But as the baby gets closer to being delivered, the birth pangs grow with intensity. And so Jesus is saying all of this stuff, it's like birth pangs, which is interesting, and it starts off mild, but it will continue to grow with intensity. Now, I've even seen it in my lifetime, the growth of the intensity of all of these things that I just mentioned. I've seen it with my own eyes. I have no doubt we are getting closer and closer to the end of time, and so what happens is these big episodes, they draw closer and closer together, and they become more and more intense, and they become more and more painful. So to say that, well, this whole situation isn't painful for us, well, it may not be yet, but I believe that it can be, and I feel that it will be. But then what does Jesus say? Here's the key word. What is the action that Jesus wants us to take? What is it? Because every good prophecy has an action. First of all, Jesus already said, don't be deceived. I want you to know and understand all this. But then he also says in chapter 24, verse 6, he says, don't be alarmed. Do not be alarmed. That word alarmed, I looked at it. What does that mean? And that means to wail or to cry out in fright or in fear. That's like screaming in fear. It just a wailing of, oh my goodness, this is terrible. Jesus says don't do that. That is actually the action item that Jesus wants you to take away from this prophecy, or he wouldn't have put it in there in the first place. He's saying don't wail and cry. Don't give in to fright and fear. That's why we're saying we're not going to be afraid of this. Should we respect the COVID-19 situation? Should we respect what's happening? Well, absolutely. Should we acknowledge and respect what's happening in the economy? Absolutely. But we're not to be alarmed and wail out and cry and fright or fear. Why? Jesus says, here's why. Because it's not the end. Jesus makes it clear. These things simply have to happen. But the end is not here yet. But there's more to come. There's more to come on this. In fact, the next episode that I'm going to be sharing of Tim at 12 in the second part of signs, I'm going to be talking about some of the other signs. We talk about basically signs in nature right now. Now the next time we're going to be talking about other signs of things that actually happen within the church. These are signs of that the end is drawing near. So I want you to know this is that what's happening now is COVID-19 as a specific situation. Is it found in the scriptures? To the best of my ability, the best of my understanding of the scriptures, I do not see that, although I do not know, and I cannot and will not emphatically say yes or no on that. But from my understanding of the book of Revelation, I just don't see it there. But is COVID-19 and all that's happening nationwide and even worldwide, is this a signal? Is this a sign? Is this a birth pang? Well, absolutely. I have no doubt in my mind about that. And this is a signal to us to get ready. I'm going to talk more about that in the next 2 weeks, how we get ready, how we prepare, what we do, but to be ready. But the main thing is right now, just don't be deceived and don't be afraid. Don't wail out in fear, because God saw this. He knew it was happening, and he's got the whole thing under control. In fact, God is ahead of you. He saw this. Jesus gave us this prophecy 2,000 years ago to a group of men who then, one of them, Matthew, sat down and wrote out what Jesus said that day, and that's what we're reading today. So we're going to be enjoying going through chapters 24 and 25 of Matthew. I want you to read the rest of it. You're going to see some really bizarre stuff in there, and we're going to talk about every bit of it. So I hope you enjoyed today's first episode of Tim at 12. I don't know where I'm going to be day after day when I'm doing this live broadcast, but it's really, really great to be able to do it. I'd love to hear your feedback. Feel free to leave me feedback, whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or watching on Vimeo or through the City Life app, City Life website. I'd love to hear a little bit of your feedback. Well, I want to speak these words over you, and I always say these over people when I'm finished with teaching. And this is based on what this is really what Moses said the Levites were to speak over God's people whenever a day wrapped up. And so we're kind of wrapping this up. So here's the blessing. This is called the Levitical or priestly blessing, and it's in English for today. And it says, God bless you and keep you. God smile on you and gift you. God look you full in the face and make you prosper so that you can keep making Jesus known. Here's your practical tip. Check on your neighbors. Check on your church family members. Check on friends. And let's keep moving forward without fear. God bless you. I'll see you guys next time.